So this set of flip notes will cover ecosystem interactions. This will be the second set of notes found in your Ecology 2 note packet. It's also going to be the last set of notes that would be found on your upcoming ecology quiz. So this is focusing on the interaction between biotic factors in an ecosystem. So the interactions between the different living components in an ecosystem, organisms in a community. Remember, community, group of living things living in a particular area, capable of interacting with each other in some very complex ways. But really, if you try to simplify what they can be doing, how organisms can be influencing one another, they can hurt each other, so they can have a negative effect on one another. They can help each other, they can have a positive effect on one another, or they can live indifferently from one another, so no net effect in either direction. And so I'll maybe call that equal. Negative, positive, and equalizing effects within the interactions that are occurring between two particular organisms or two species. So when we look at these interactions and we examine, first up would be examining interactions that we would consider to be negative, all right? The first interaction to discuss would be competition. So competition occurs anytime you have two or more organisms, could be the same or different species, trying to use the same resource at the same time. So this is happening within a community, two species or two members of one species trying to access any type of resource. Now, a resource can be anything that's necessary for life. Resources can be water, nutrients, light, food, space for nesting or habitat, etc. It could be mates. If you're one species, you could be fighting over mates. And so when we look at and examine competition, we have different sort of names for competition depending on who's competing. So this idea of intra-specific competition, members of the same species. Intra-specific basically means within a species. So that's two members of the same species competing for a particular resource. Interspecific, okay, means basically between. Okay, so these are members of different species competing with one another. And so we'll look at some examples of each of those. So all the examples pictured here represent intraspecific. Remember, intra, within a single species competing for one another. So at the top left here, we have barnacles. Barnacles live in intertidal zones. Think of like rocks around the ocean, piers, the bottoms of boats, sometimes the skin of whales. These particular barnacles would be competing for food, but the main thing they're competing for right now is space. Okay, there's very little open spaces on their substrate, and so the barnacles that can sort of gain access to this prime spots are going to be the biggest, while the ones that are less able to compete for space are going to remain small. Over here we've got baby birds in a nest, okay, and they're going to be competing for food. Now they are related. These are all brothers and sisters, but the strongest bird is going to get the most food, so it will grow the largest and leave the nest the soonest. And so that's going to be intra-specific competition, even though they're relatives. The elk down here at the bottom are going to be competing for mates, right? They are battling for access to a female or a group of females. The females are going to get to choose the winner, or the winner is going to get access to mate with the females. So they're competing. And then one that's really often not considered by many people outside of ecology, things like plants. These plants are all competing for access to light. the tallest plants are, or the fastest growing plants are going to get more light than the plants that are stuck in the understory. And that's going to limit their abilities. So there's actually competitive ability for accessing resources like light, or think of the opposite happening underneath the soil, competing with their roots for access to water. These are all then examples of interspecific competition, competing between species. So here's the same thing happening for plants, access to light. And so this plant right here is a strangler fig. Strangler figs are a type of tree that will grow up the side of another tree. Look, see how it's using the other tree to hold it up. It will go up into the top, and then it will shade out the tree that it climbed up. It does this basically for speed. The faster it can get up to the light, the more competitive it is, and so it hitches a ride on another tree that probably grew more slowly to reach the point that it's at. And it can usually, or sometimes, result in the death of the tree that it climbed up. We can have competition for food, right? We've got cardinals and black-capped chickadees at the same feeder, eating the same seeds. So they're competing between the species for access to the food. Now, the feeders are obviously a resource plentiful type area, when these birds, in the absence of feeders, would be out in nature trying to access the same foods or similar food types. And predation is an example of interspecific competition. Okay, so this individual is trying to live by avoiding being eaten, and this individual is also trying to live by gaining food. And so they're at odds with one another. They have sort of different goals for the outcome of this lynx and snowshoe hare interaction. Same type of thing here with the lion and the hyenas. They are likely fighting over a kill. Okay, so the hyenas are probably coming in trying to steal food from the lion after it was successfully hunting. When we start to look and examine some of these interactions a little more closely, predation is a really interesting interaction or type of competition between organisms. We have two main roles in predation. We have the predator, that's the organism that does the killing and the eating, and the prey. And so here we have got a jumping spider and a fly as our predator prey. Notice the fly is just about as big as the spider, and there's lots of examples through history when we get to look at populations where there's a really closely tied relationship between population numbers of predator and prey. When there's lots of prey, there can be lots of predators, and when there's not as many prey, there can be not as many predators. So they have they're really tied closely together in this predator-prey relationship for population numbers. We'll look at that in a later set of notes. Symbiosis, this is used all the time. This is a term that you see in a lot of movies, symbiosis. And it's always, in movies, meant to be a beneficial relationship for both organisms. That's a little bit of a misdefinition. Symbiosis simply describes where there's a permanent association between organisms of two different species. Okay? It doesn't imply that it's always beneficial for both in that term. When symbiosis is beneficial for both organisms, we call that mutualism. Okay, we have a different form of symbiosis. It's beneficial for one and has no effect on the other. That's called commensalism. And then parasitism is when it's beneficial for one organism and negative for the other. So symbiosis is not limited to the beneficial relationship only. So here's some examples of different symbiotic relationships. Predation shouldn't be on this slide. It's an error. Commensalism. This is an air plant. You'd find these in Florida, southeastern United States, and it's just simply growing up on another tree for access to light. It's not out competing that tree. It's not stealing sugars from that tree, so it's not a parasite. Commensalism. Mutualism could be like a clownfish and an anemone. The clownfish will actually sometimes provide food for the anemone. The anemone provides protection to the clownfish, and so both organisms are being benefited. So mutualism, relationship in which both species benefit. There are a wide variety of examples of mutualistic interactions, but they could include intestinal bacteria, lichens. Remember, we talked about lichens. They're a symbiotic relationship between an algae and a fungi. Can grow on brick and sidewalks and rocks and tree bark. Pollinators, bees and flowers. That's mutualism. The flower is giving the bee nectar, which is food, and the bee is serving as a pollinator. It's carrying male gametes from one flower to another. We could have lots of different cleaner organisms, like this cleaner shrimp. So it's removing parasites from this eel. Okay, so the eel's benefiting from losing parasites. The shrimp is eating the parasites, so it's getting food. And so these organisms that visit cleaners, whether the cleaners could be shrimp, they could be birds. Okay, so there are birds that clean the mouths of crocodiles and ticks off of buffalo. The cleaners could be fish. Okay, the organisms that use cleaner organisms won't eat them because they want to receive that benefit. This is an ant that is basically kind of farming these aphids, these black guys here. So the ants provide protection and the aphids provide food. And the ants and the aphids together are also living on a tree. The ants in the tree would probably be mutualistic. The aphids in the tree would probably be more on the parasitic side because the aphids are feeding off of the tree. So a lot of complex interactions happening here between three different species. Commensalism there is the relationship in which two organisms together, one benefits and the other is unaffected. So this is sort of the plus and equal or plus and zero relationship. So this could be like barnacles on a whale. Okay, if you're a barnacle and you live on a whale, you get to travel around and go to a lot of different areas to provide food. The whale isn't really being harmed. The barnacles aren't like drinking the whale's blood or anything like that. They might itch the whale. So the whale's not real huge fan here, but it's not being harmed. Here's an orchid then living up in a sort of a nook on a tree. And so the orchid's not typically parasitizing this other tree. It's just using the tree to get higher up, access to light and moisture, and things like that. So this is called commensalism. So parasites are going to be our last symbiotic interaction. These are when members of one species derive benefit at the expense of another. So this is a plus-minus relationship. We've got two roles here, the parasite and the host. The parasite is the organism that gets the benefit. The host is the organism that the parasite feeds on. These would include ticks, mistletoe, bacteria, mosquitoes, viruses, some different intestinal or internal worms, flatworms, roundworms, nematode worms, annelid worms, etc. that can benefit. We looked at parasitic wasps. Here's another example. This is wasp eggs that have been laid on this caterpillar. As they hatch out, they're going to feed on that caterpillar. So that caterpillar is sort of a dead caterpillar crawling or walking as we see it there. And so these are long-term relationships in some cases, like the worms. Could be a long-term interaction between the parasite and the host. Some of them, like a mosquito, could be a very short-term interaction. It gets its blood meal and it leaves quickly. Parasites typically, outside of sort of these wasp-type interactions, not usually trying to kill the host. Why? Because if you kill your host, then you can't continue to parasitize it in the future, but sometimes do result in host death. So that's going to wrap up our talk of the interactions between sort of different organisms in a community or ecosystem.